when I lecture on redress, I oftentimes tell the students that the redress movement was full of moments of great fortune, of good fortune, and I think that this was one of them where Aiko stumbled upon this document that was on an archivist's desk. But it's much more than great fortune, because she needed to be able to look at that document in a few seconds and know that it was different than all of the other documents that had been circulated, and that this was the one document that had not been destroyed. Literally, there was probably only 2 people in the world at that time that could have made that distinction. One of them was Aiko, and the other one I would say was Jack, her husband. Those, without her knowledge, without her painstaking hours of work and understanding and remembering the differences that were apparent in that document, we might have stumbled upon that document, but just assumed that it was one of the copies that had been produced later on. So it's not simply her hard work and her diligence, but it really was her brilliance and her ability to put pieces together that made that find so wonderful. And it really was critical.
Aiko, did they let you make a Xerox copy?
Oh, yes.
They did.
I think it's 461 pages or something like that, which is a very thick document.
The question for the videotape, the question was, did they allow Aiko to make a photocopy of the document? The answer is yes.
Yes, I had established a good relationship with the military reference branch in the archives by that time, having been there for 15, 20 years. And I asked if I could have a copy of it, every page. And we had paid for it, of course, but they said sure, and they did. So that was the instrument that I was able to get. So we had to have that to prove in the quorum nobis cases, you know, certain pages of it to prove what the lawyers were trying to convince the court, that we were placed in these camps without justification, based a lot on lies. Reminds me of weapons of mass destruction. You know?
We have time for, let's go to this question.
Thanks a lot for sharing like both the ordinary and the extraordinary stories from your family. It seems like the time for Japanese Americans was really after 9/11, where all of this history from the Niseis to the Redress movement to all these Day of Remembrances, our community stepped up and we were there, in solidarity with the Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. And what I think is interesting is that your political development, what you were talking about, is you were influenced by more than just the Japanese American community. It was a very multicultural consciousness raising in all of your lives. So do you feel like there are political issues for Japanese Americans today, or do you feel like that the issues that we as a community should be taking on are broader? Like, are there specific Japanese American politics today?
I think so. I think for JAs, especially since I'm Yonsei Gosei, everybody's kids that are coming up now are even more more Americanized, I guess you would say. So I think a big issue facing JAs now is, we have to re-identify ourselves. I think a lot of, for me, we try to say, okay, we're Americanized. We're not like immigrants. And that's a whole nother issue. It's like, I would take on more like black culture, or some other people take on Caucasian culture more than Japanese culture. So I think that's a big thing for JAs nowadays, especially younger generations, is that they gotta, what are we about now? Are we just about becoming dentists and orthodontists and things like that, and moving to Orange County or something, or what are we about? All the other Asian immigrants are creating their identities and stuff like that. So I think that's one big issue that JAs nowadays are facing.
I'd like to make a comment on that. we were talking to a young man that's going to UCLA, and he said, he said, I'm really excited about this election. And he said, then there's no excitement like there was in the 60s. And he said that in the Japanese and the Asian community, he's not an Asian, he's Caucasian, but he's cognizant of it, knowing that I'm an Asian. And he said, and they're not, I said, well, how about the Yonsei, et cetera, at UCLA? Well, no, they're not interested at all. And then, or very little, he said. But he said, most of the kids at UCLA are Asians, but they're studying really hard, and a lot of them were not born in this country. And so he said, it's a very dead place politically at UCLA these days.
Well, I
And,
just graduated in this past June from UCLA, and I'm one of those Gosei Japanese Americans. I wasn't a part of Nikkei Student Union, but they are politically involved, I believe, because I know quite a few of them. And I don't think that gentleman knows that many Japanese Americans that are there, because they are politically involved. But in general, Asian Americans at UCLA, or actually all students at UCLA, or not all students, that's too much generalization. Students at UCLA aren't very political because they have to focus so much on their studies because it's a very competitive university. But I'm very lucky to have politics at the dinner table, right? So I feel a little different from everyone else, but when elections come up and different issues like the war, no one even would think about a draft or a possible draft. And that would affect every student at UCLA, but that would not cross their minds. For Asian Americans at UCLA, many of them are first or second generation Asians, so their parents aren't very politically involved, meaning they aren't either, so they're focused on their studies, they're focused on going to parties on the weekends, things like that. And whereas an huge election that's coming up this year, there is very little involvement, which is kind of a concern, especially for me, because I am a part of that generation. And until something really big happens, I don't feel they'll become involved and play a big role, which they should, because this generation should play a huge role pushing issues for Asian Americans, and I'm sure my dad could talk a lot more about that too.
Warren, I see you grabbing that mic, but time is upon us and I need to move us forward. We're running down on time, and I'm going to ask the last two questions and wrap up. And the first question is to either Sei or Joey or both of you. If somebody came to you and knew nothing about nothing, didn't know your family, didn't know the Japanese American experience, in a minute or less, what would you tell them about who your family is?
Well, I would tell them that our family is a group of people who are very proud. They fight hard for what they believe in. They are not constrained by conventional ideas, and that we're very close. And I think there's a fire in our family. I think that's the most important thing, is there's a fire in our family where that drives everybody to do whatever they do, whether it be politics, music, sports, just doing whatever they do to the best of their ability and having fun. And I think that's how I describe our family.
I guess because we've talked a lot about history, I think we're an amazing product of history, and we embrace that and learn from it, and that strengthens us as a family. Yeah.